You think you know what grief does to a man. You think it just makes him sad. You think it just makes him quiet. But out in the vast empty plains of 1884 Wyoming, grief wasn't a feeling. It was a creature. It was a living, breathing thing that wrapped its cold arms around Elias Vance and squeezed. For 5 years it had been his only companion. His ranch was a tiny scar on a landscape that didn't care he existed. A small cabin, a barn, and a few fences were all he had to show for his life. The world was so big and so quiet out there, it felt like it ate sound. And for Elias, that was the whole point. He wanted the quiet. He needed it, because in the silence, he could almost forget. 5 years. That's how long it had been since he dug a grave for his wife, Martha, and the baby boy who never drew a breath. He'd carved her name on a stone with his own 2 hands, but he couldn't bring himself to carve a name for the boy. He didn't have one. Since then, his world had become a prison of his own making, bounded by his property lines. The folks in the nearest town called him the widower, a ghost haunting the edges of civilization. They saw the cold fire in his eyes and knew to leave him be, and that was just the way he liked it. Every day was the same. Mend the fence, feed the cattle, chop the wood, a rhythm designed to keep the memories from creeping in. In the evenings, he'd sit on his porch and watch the sky bleed out, letting the darkness swallow him whole. He wasn't living. He was waiting, waiting for the wind and the rain to wear him down, just like they wore down the mountains. And then, one day, the rain came and didn't stop for a week. The world turned to mud. The creek near his property swelled into a roaring brown monster. He rode out on his horse, Apollo, to check for damage, his mind on the usual worries. Washed out posts, downed wire, lost cattle. The sun was a pale, sickly disk in the sky. The whole world seemed to be holding its breath. He was riding along the swollen creek when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. It wasn't an animal. It was thin and weak and human. He pulled Apollo to a stop, every nerve ending on fire. He listened. There it was again, almost lost in the roar of the water. It was coming from a marshy inlet downstream, a place he knew was dangerous, a place the earth turned to quicksand. His first instinct was to turn around, to ride away. This was trouble. Trouble was a tear in the fabric of his perfect, miserable isolation. The world and its problems were not his anymore. He had built his walls high for a reason, but the sound came a third time, a desperate little whimper that scraped at something buried deep inside him. A piece of the man he used to be, a piece of the man Martha had loved. With a curse that was half prayer, he spurred Apollo forward, the horse's hooves sinking in the greedy mud. And that's when he saw it, a splash of color against the brown muck, the deep blue of a beaded dress. It was a girl. Couldn't have been more than 16, and she was sunk to her waist in the sucking, pulling earth. Her face was a mess of mud and tears, her dark hair stuck to her skin. She was Cheyenne. He could see it in her dress, in the fine bones of her face. She had stopped screaming. She was just watching him, her eyes wide with a terror that was slowly giving way to exhaustion. She was sinking, and he was the only one there to see it. For a long, frozen moment, Elias just sat there on his horse. This girl was a universe of trouble, a Cheyenne girl dying on his land. Helping her meant questions, it meant talking, it meant breaking the silent pact he'd made with the world 5 years ago. But leaving her meant becoming something else. A monster. A man who could watch a child die and just ride away. And even in the deepest pit of his grief, he knew he wasn't that man. Martha wouldn't have recognized that man. He swung down from his horse, his own boots sinking into the wet ground. "Easy now," he said, his voice a rusty croak. He grabbed the lariat from his saddle, tied one end to the horn, and walked as close as he dared. "Don't struggle," he said, his voice firm. "The more you fight, the faster it pulls you down." She didn't understand his words, but she understood the tone. A tiny flicker of hope sparked in her eyes. He found a long, thick branch and pushed it out toward her. "Get your arms over this. Spread your weight." She reached for it, her fingers fumbling with the wet bark. She tried to pull, but the effort only made her sink deeper. A sob broke from her lips. "All right, hold on," Elias grunted. He made a loop in his rope and threw it. The aim was true. It landed perfectly over her head and shoulders. He used his hands to show her what to do, to get it under her arms. Her fingers were so cold she could barely move them. But finally, she got it secured. "All right, Apollo," he called out, his voice calm and steady. "Back. Easy now. Back." The old horse leaned into the work, backing up one slow, powerful step at a time. The rope went taut. "Hold on to that log," Elias yelled. The quicksand did not want to let her go. It pulled and sucked, a greedy monster. The girl cried out in pain as the rope bit into her skin, but she held on. For a sickening moment, he thought it wasn't going to work. Then with a grotesque, thick slop, the earth released its grip. Apollo dragged her clear onto the damp grass. She lay there like a broken doll, covered head to toe in a thick plaster of gray mud, shivering uncontrollably. Elias rushed to her side, untying the rope. Her breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper. He knew he couldn't leave her here. The sun was already starting to dip, and the night would bring a cold that could kill her. The only place to go was his cabin, his sanctuary, his tomb. The thought of another person in that silent space felt like a violation, a betrayal of the perfect, sterile grief he had spent 5 years building. But the alternative was watching her die. With a sigh that felt like it carried the weight of his entire life, he lifted her into his arms. She was so light. She didn't make a sound, just collapsed against him as he carried her to Apollo. He glanced back at the disturbed patch of quicksand, a fresh scar on the land. He felt a deep shift inside him, like the ground cracking open beneath his own feet. The walls he had built so carefully had just been breached. The silence was officially broken, and he had a terrible feeling that the trouble was just getting started. He laid her on his own cot, not caring about the mud and water soaking into the mattress. He moved with a stiff, unfamiliar urgency, building the fire until it roared to life, casting dancing shadows that made the small cabin feel alive for the first time in years. He put a kettle on to boil. He found his cleanest wool blanket and covered her with it. He knew he should get her out of those wet clothes, but the thought made his hands feel clumsy and strange. He hadn't touched another person with gentleness in half a decade. Instead, he set a basin of warm water and a rag beside the cot and retreated to the other side of the room. He sat in the worn wooden chair that used to be Martha's and just watched. He watched this stranger he had pulled from the jaws of the earth. And as he watched her, his eyes drifted up to the photograph on the mantelpiece. Martha, smiling. It felt like two worlds were colliding in his tiny, quiet home. His dead past and this breathing, intrusive present. He had saved this girl's life, but he had no idea how to save his own. And for the first time in a long, long time, he felt the terrifying possibility that he might have to try. She slept for a full day and a night. He watched over her, his rifle across his lap. Though he knew the real threat wasn't outside, it was inside. It was in the memories her presence stirred up. When she finally woke, it was with a sharp, terrified gasp. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on him with a flash of fear. He stayed in his chair and pointed to a bowl of broth he'd left for her. "Food," he said. The single word sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. Hunger eventually won out over fear. She drank the broth, her eyes never leaving his face. For 2 days they lived in a silent truce. He learned her ankle was sprained and bandaged it. She learned he was a man locked in a routine of grief. She would watch him staring at the photograph on the mantel, her own expression impossible to read. Communication was a game of gestures. He pointed to his chest. "Elias." She watched him for a long moment, then touched her own. "Mesa," she whispered. Her name was Mesa. And giving her a name changed everything. She was a person now, with a family who must be searching for her. He knew he had to get her back to them, but he had no idea how. On the third morning, the decision was made for him. He was outside splitting wood when he saw them. A line of 5 riders on the horizon, moving fast. Cheyenne warriors. His blood ran cold. He put down the axe. He would not meet them holding a weapon. They thundered up to his cabin and surrounded him, their faces grim, their eyes hard as stone. The man in the lead, older, with gray-streaked hair, carried the authority of a chief. Just then, the cabin door creaked open. Mesa stood there, leaning on the frame. When she saw the riders, a cry of relief broke from her lips. "Voken!" she called. The chief's face, which had been a mask of worry, flooded with relief when he saw his daughter. He swung down from his horse, but then his eyes moved from Mesa to Elias, and the hardness came rushing back. He saw a white man, and he saw his daughter limping and disheveled, coming out of that white man's cabin. His mind drew a swift, ugly conclusion. His hand went to the knife at his belt. The other warriors reached for their weapons. The air crackled. Elias didn't move. He just held the chief's gaze. He knew his life now depended entirely on what this girl, this stranger he'd pulled from the mud, would say next. Mesa saw the danger in an instant. She limped forward, placing herself between her father and Elias. She started speaking rapidly in her own tongue, her voice urgent and clear. She pointed to the creek. She mimicked sinking, struggling. She pointed at Elias, then at the rope still on his saddle. She pointed back inside the cabin, at the cot, at the empty broth bowl. She lifted her bandaged ankle. Her story poured out of her, washing over the tense clearing. As she spoke, Elias watched the chief's face. He saw suspicion slowly, painfully, turn into understanding. The hard lines around his eyes softened. He looked from his daughter's earnest face to Elias's stoic one. When Mesa finished, the silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence. The threat was gone. One of the younger warriors translated for the chief, whose name was Vulcan. She says you pulled her from the swallowing earth. She says you gave her shelter and food. You did not harm her. Elias just gave a single curt nod. She was in trouble. I helped. Vulcan studied him for another long moment. Then he spoke, and the warrior translated again. Our law is a law of balance. A life was given back from the earth. A debt is owed. Elias wanted nothing. He just wanted them to leave and return him to his silence. No debt is owed, he said flatly. Many would have ridden on, the translator said, after another word from the chief, or would have demanded payment. You are an honorable man. Vulcan stepped forward and placed a hand over his own heart, then extended it toward Elias in a gesture of peace. After a moment, Elias mirrored it. They took Mesa and left. As they rode away, he thought that was the end of it. The world had intruded, and he had pushed it back out. He could go back to his quiet grief. He could go back to being a ghost. He was wrong. The trouble wasn't over. In fact, it hadn't even truly begun. Just before they disappeared over the horizon, Mesa turned back. She looked at him, and her eyes weren't just filled with gratitude. They were filled with fear. That look haunted him for a week, the fear in her eyes. It wasn't the fear of a girl who had almost died in quicksand. It was something else. Something she hadn't told her father. Something she hadn't told him. Elias tried to push it away, to sink back into his routine. But the silence in his cabin felt different now. It felt watchful. He kept finding himself looking toward the horizon, expecting to see those riders again, or something worse. He was cleaning out the mud-caked blanket she had used when he felt it. A small, hard lump sewn into the hem, so skillfully hidden he never would have noticed if the fabric hadn't been worn thin. His fingers, clumsy from years of rough work, fumbled with the stitches. He pulled out a tiny leather pouch, no bigger than his thumb. It was tightly bound with a sinew cord. This was hers. She had hidden it. What could a young girl be hiding that was so important? He hesitated. This was her secret. It wasn't his business. But the memory of her terrified eyes pushed him forward. He untied the cord. Inside wasn't a charm or a stone. It was a single polished nugget of gold. It was heavy in his palm, bigger and purer than any he'd ever seen. Gold like this didn't come from the streams in this part of Wyoming. This came from a deep mine. But there was something else in the pouch. A small, folded piece of oilskin. He carefully unfolded it. It wasn't a letter. It was a map. Or a piece of one. It showed a series of tunnels marked with strange symbols he didn't recognize. This wasn't just a girl who had gotten lost. This was a girl on the run, and she was carrying a secret big enough to get someone killed. Suddenly, the quiet of his ranch didn't feel safe anymore. It felt exposed. He was standing in his cabin, holding a treasure map and a piece of impossible gold, and he realized with a sinking feeling that Mesa hadn't brought trouble to his door. She had been running from a trouble so immense, it was about to swallow them all. He barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. He hid the pouch in a loose stone of his hearth. A secret buried within a secret. 2 days later, they came. Not the Cheyenne. 3 white men, dressed in the rough clothes of prospectors, their faces hard and sun-scorched. They were led by a man with a jagged scar that pulled one side of his mouth into a permanent sneer. His name was Silas. They said they were looking for a lost horse, but their eyes weren't on the pasture. They were on Elias, on his cabin. "Ain't seen anyone passing through here, have you?" Silas asked, his voice like gravel. "An Indian girl, maybe." The air went still. Elias leaned against the doorframe, keeping his body casual, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Just me and the wind out here," he said, his voice flat. Silas's eyes narrowed. He didn't believe him, not for a second. "Funny thing," Silas said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice near Elias's boot. "We've been tracking this girl for a week. She stole something valuable, from us." He let the threat hang in the air. "These Cheyenne, they're a den of thieves. If you see her, you'd be wise to let us know. We'd make it worth your while." Elias didn't say a word. He just stared back, his hand resting near the axe he'd been using. After a long, tense moment, Silas and his men turned their horses and rode off, but not before giving the ranch one last, long look. It wasn't a departure. It was a promise. They would be back. Elias was no longer a bystander. He was a player in a game he didn't understand. He had lied to protect a girl he barely knew, a girl who was herself lying about something massive. He was caught between a crew of violent prospectors and a Cheyenne tribe that was clearly hiding its own secrets. He looked out at the vast, empty land that had once been his comfort. Now it just looked like a place with nowhere to hide. The silence he had craved for 5 years was gone, replaced by the hum of a coming storm, and he was standing right in the middle of its path. 4 days later, Chief Voken returned. This time there were no warriors, just family. Mesa was with him, looking healthier, but her eyes were still shadowed with that same fear. They brought gifts: fine blankets, tanned hides, dried meat. Elias met them in the yard, his mind racing. Voken dismounted, a broad, practiced smile on his face. The young warrior who translated was there again. "Elias Vance," the warrior said, his voice full of ceremony, "Chief Voken has come to pay the life debt. He has seen your home. He sees you are a man alone, a sad and lonely way for an honorable man to live." Elias's gut tightened. He knew this wasn't just a social call. Voken gestured to the 2 young women who had dismounted behind him. They were Mesa's sisters, beautiful and proud, their eyes cast to the ground. "These are my other daughters," the translator announced, "Vavina and Sautayo. They are strong and will bear strong sons. Chief Voken, in his gratitude, honors you. He offers you his daughters, as your wives." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. Wives, plural. He stared, dumbfounded, at the 2 girls, then at the smiling chief. This had to be a joke, a mistaken translation. But the solemn look on everyone's face told him it was deadly serious. This was the payment, and in that moment, Elias understood. This wasn't an honor, it was a cage. Voken wasn't just thanking him. He was trying to buy his silence. He was trying to bind Elias to his family, to his tribe, making him an accomplice to whatever secret they were hiding about that gold. The offer wasn't a gift, it was a leash, and it meant that the danger Mesa was in came from her own people. A wave of loyalty to Martha rose in his throat, hot and sharp. The idea of any other woman in his house was a desecration, but he knew he was standing on a knife's edge. To refuse a chief's gift was a profound insult. It could make him an enemy to the only people who might protect him from Silas. He had to choose his words carefully. He took a slow breath. "Your chief," Elias began, his voice raspy, speaking to the translator but looking straight at Voken. "His honor is a mountain. His daughters are beautiful. Any man would be proud." He let the words hang in the air, a respectful preamble to the refusal he knew could get him killed. He saw a flicker of pride in Voken's eyes. "But I cannot accept this great honor," Elias continued, his voice dropping. "It is not a rejection of his friendship." He turned and pointed to the cabin door. "I must show you why." He pushed the door open and pointed to the faded photograph on the mantel. "There, That is my wife. Vulcan and the translator peered inside. The two sisters, their curiosity sparked, moved closer to see. Her name was Martha, Elias said softly, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. She died 5 years ago, with our son. He touched his own chest. My heart is with her, buried under that cottonwood tree on the hill. To take a new wife would be a lie. It would not be worthy of the honor your chief offers. It would not be worthy of his daughters. He had laid his scarred heart bare, hoping the truth of his grief would be a language the chief could understand. The translator quietly relayed his words. Vulcan listened, his gaze moving from Elias's face to the photograph and back again. The big smile was gone, replaced by a look of deep, solemn contemplation. He was a man who understood honor, and he was a man who understood loss. He saw the truth in Elias's haunted eyes. He said something low and quiet. The chief understands, the translator said. He says a heart that is buried with the dead is a sacred thing. Your loyalty is a mark of great strength. Vulcan then turned to Elias and placed a hand on his shoulder. The life debt remains, the translator relayed, but it will be paid with friendship, not with wives. You will be known as the man with one heart. A wave of relief washed over Elias. He had navigated the impossible. But as they prepared to leave, something happened. The younger sister, Sautayo, the one with the defiant spark in her eyes, walked past the woodpile where he stood. As she passed, her hand brushed against the stacked logs, and Elias saw a small object fall from her fingers, landing silently in the dirt. She didn't break her stride. She didn't look back. It was a deliberate secret act. After they were gone, specks on the horizon once more, Elias walked to the woodpile. He knelt down. Lying in the dirt was a small carved piece of wood. It was an animal totem, a hawk. He stared at it for a long moment, his mind racing. Then he went back inside, pulled the hidden pouch from the hearth, and unfolded the oilskin map. His blood ran cold. One of the strange symbols marking a tunnel on the map was a hawk. It was an identical match. It wasn't just a map, it was a message. And the chief's daughter had just given him the key. That night the wind howled like a hungry wolf, rattling the window panes of the small cabin. Elias sat in Martha's chair, the carved hawk in one hand, the map in the other, trying to piece together a puzzle that felt like it had no edges. The gift from Sautayo was a clear sign. She was trying to tell him something her father wouldn't. She was defying him. Why? The front door creaked, a sound so faint he almost missed it. He was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the frame. A lone figure was huddled against the wall of the cabin, seeking shelter from the wind. It wasn't Silas. It wasn't a warrior. It was Sautayo. She was alone. He opened the door a crack. "What are you doing here?" he whispered, his voice harsh. "You'll be seen." She slipped inside, quick as a shadow, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. She was shivering, but not just from the cold. "Must speak," she whispered in broken, halting English. "Father, he does not see the truth." She took a deep breath, her gaze darting around the small cabin as if the walls themselves were listening. "The gold," she said, her voice barely audible. "It is from a sacred place, a secret mine. Our grandfather's spirit lives in that mountain." She told him a story that made the hair on his arms stand up. There was a new power rising in her tribe, a charismatic but brutal warrior named Kemi. Kemi saw the white settlers encroaching, saw the buffalo disappearing, and he preached a sermon of fire and blood. He believed the only way for the Cheyenne to survive was to go to war. The gold was his key. Kemi had made a secret deal with the prospector, Silas. He would trade the sacred gold for repeating rifles. Enough guns to start a war that would paint the Wyoming plains red. "My sister, Mesa," Sautayo whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "She heard their plan. She knows it will be the end of our people, not our salvation. She stole a nugget and the map of the tunnels to prove it. She was running, trying to reach the Lakota to ask for their help when she fell." It all clicked into place. The fear in Mesa's eyes, the lies, the chief's strange behavior. "Your father?" Elias asked. "He knows." Saltayo shook her head, a gesture of profound sadness. He is caught. Kemi has many warriors who follow him. My father fears a civil war. He tries to keep peace, to hold us together. The marriage offer, it was to make you family, to bring you into the circle of trust. He saw your honor, and he is desperate for allies. She believed her father's caution would be their doom. She believed Keme was too strong, too persuasive. He will win, she said, her voice trembling. He will dig up the heart of our mountain and trade it for death. She looked at him, her dark eyes pleading. I saw how you stood against my father. I saw you would not be bought. You are the man with one heart. You must help us. Hitty. Before Elias could even process the request, a sound from outside shattered the night. A horse's whinny, sharp and panicked. Then another. He rushed to the window. In the pale moonlight, he could see them, Silas and his men. But there were more this time, at least half a dozen, spreading out, surrounding the cabin. They weren't coming to ask questions. A gunshot exploded, and a slug of lead tore through the wooden wall, inches from his head. They were under attack. Elias shoved Salteo to the floor. Stay down, he yelled, grabbing his rifle. The quiet man who had hidden from the world for 5 years was gone. In his place was a man with everything to lose. Another shot splintered the doorframe. Glass shattered as the window blew inwards. They were trapped. They want the map, Sotayo cried from the floor. And Mesa. They think Mesa is still here, Elias realized. He fired back through the broken window, the roar of the rifle deafening in the small space. A cry of pain from the darkness told him he'd hit one of them. But there were too many. They were methodically closing in, using the fences and the woodpile for cover. He was a rancher, not a soldier. He had a rifle and a pistol, but his ammunition was limited. This wasn't a fight he could win. It was a slaughter waiting to happen. He looked at Saltayo, her face pale in the flickering firelight. He had pulled her sister from the mud, and now they were both going to die in his house. The promise he had made to Martha's memory, to simply endure, to fade away, was being torn apart by bullets and violence. He had to do something, something desperate. The hearth, he said, his mind racing. The stone I told you about. He pointed to the loose stone where he'd hidden the golden map. When I give the signal, you run. Run for the barn. Get Apollo. Don't wait for me. Ride east. Don't stop. No, she protested. I will not leave you. You must, he roared over the sound of another gunshot. The secret of the mine dies with you if you don't. Kimmy wins. Go. He saw the terrible conflict in her eyes, the choice between loyalty and duty. The firing from outside suddenly stopped. An eerie silence fell. Vance! Silas's voice boomed through the night. Send out the girl in the map, and we'll let you live. It was a lie. He knew it was a lie. They would kill him the second he stepped outside. This was their only chance. Get ready, he whispered to Saltayo. He took a deep breath, kicked over his oil lamp, and plunged the room into darkness, save for the dying embers in the fireplace. Then he let out a guttural yell and fired his last 2 pistol rounds through the front door. In the confusion, he screamed, Now! Go! He heard her scramble toward the back of the cabin, toward a small window he used for ventilation. He reloaded his rifle in the dark, his hands moving on pure instinct. He heard a crash as she broke through the small window frame. He prayed she was fast enough. He turned back to the front, ready to sell his life as dearly as possible, to buy her a few more seconds. But as he looked through the broken window, he saw something that made his heart stop. It wasn't Silas or his men. It was riders. A dozen of them, cresting the hill, their forms silhouetted against the moon. It was the Cheyenne. But were they here to save him or to join the siege? The riders swept down the hill like ghosts, silent and deadly. They weren't Kim's warriors. Elias recognized the markings on the lead horse. It was Chief Voken. Hope surged through him, hot and fierce. But the hope died as soon as it was born. The Cheyenne didn't attack Silas's men. They reined in their horses, forming a wide, menacing circle around the cabin, trapping Silas's men and Elias in the same net. Voken rode forward into the moonlight, his face a mask of cold fury. Silas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Right on time, Chief, he called out. Looks like your little girl came crying to the white man after all. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. This wasn't a rescue. It was a trap. A deal had been made. Voken was working with Silas. Sautayo, who had frozen at the edge of the barn, saw it too. She let out a small, strangled cry of disbelief. Her own father. He had aligned himself with the very men who wanted to desecrate their sacred land. Elias understood the horrifying truth in that single, terrible moment. Sotayo had been right about her father's desperation, but wrong about his methods. Voken wasn't trying to keep the peace through inaction. He was trying to cut out the cancer. He had made a deal with Silas to eliminate Kimmy's faction and anyone else who knew about the mine, including his own daughters and the nosy rancher, who had stumbled into the middle of it. He was sacrificing a few to save the tribe. He was sacrificing his own children. "It's over, Vance," Silas yelled. "The chief and I have an arrangement. Give us the map and the girl, and he'll let you walk away." Another lie. Elias was the loose end. He knew too much. He looked over at Sautayo, who was staring at her father, her face a portrait of betrayal. They were completely, utterly alone. Elias had a choice: surrender and die, or fight and die. He raised his rifle. If he was going to hell, he was going to send Silas there first. But before he could fire, Voken raised a hand. He spoke, his voice ringing out in the Cheyenne tongue, powerful and clear. A dozen of his warriors suddenly broke from the main group, not attacking Silas, but riding hard toward the east, toward Kem's camp. At the same time, another group broke west. Then Voken turned his horse, not toward Elias, but toward Silas, and let out a war cry that ripped through the night. Voken's warriors who had remained with him lowered their lances and charged. Silas and his men, caught completely by surprise, barely had time to raise their rifles. It wasn't a deal. It wasn't a betrayal. It was the most elaborate, high-stakes deception Elias had ever witnessed. Voken hadn't made a deal with Silas. He had used Silas. He had used the attack on Elias's cabin as a distraction, a way to draw Silas and his men into the open while he sent his warriors to deal with Kim's faction at their own camp. Sotayo's secret visit, her plea for help. Voken must have known about it. He had counted on it. He had used his own daughter's defiance and Elias's honor as bait in a much larger trap. The night exploded into chaos. The quiet ranch became a battlefield. Voken's warriors crashed into the prospectors' line, and the fight devolved into a brutal, close-quarters melee of knives, arrows, and panicked gunshots. Elias didn't hesitate. He wasn't the bait anymore. He was a part of the fight. He fired from the cabin window, taking aim at the prospectors, helping to even the odds. He saw Sautayo, no longer frozen in shock, but moving with purpose. She untied Apollo and the other horses, sending them galloping into the night to add to the confusion. A brilliant and brave act of sabotage. Elias's fight narrowed to one man. Silas. The scarred prospector was trying to retreat, firing wildly as he backed away toward his horse. Elias burst out of the cabin, ignoring the danger, his sights set on the man who had brought this firestorm to his door. He tackled him, sending them both sprawling into the mud. The fight was ugly and desperate. Silas was strong, fueled by greed and rage. He drew a Bowie knife, its blade glinting in the moonlight. Elias, armed only with the fury that had been simmering for 5 long years, fought back like a cornered animal. He was no longer the hollowed-out man waiting to die. He was fighting for the flicker of life he had rediscovered, for the girl in the mud, for the sister who risked everything, for the chief who played a deadly game for the soul of his people. He managed to get his hands on a heavy piece of firewood and brought it down on Silas's arm with a sickening crack. The knife clattered to the ground. The fight was over. As he looked up, breathing heavily, he saw the battle was ending. Voken's warriors were victorious. The remaining prospectors had surrendered or fled into the darkness. In the center of it all stood Voken, tall and imposing. A few feet away from him lay the body of Kim. The ambitious warrior had not been at his camp. He had been here all along, hiding among Silas's men, waiting to claim his prize. Voken had faced his rival, and the chief's authority had been sealed in blood. Silence fell over the ranch, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the nervous nickering of horses. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Voken walked over to Elias, who was still standing over the defeated Silas. The chief's face was grim, but his eyes held a deep, profound respect. He spoke. and the young warrior, who had somehow survived the fight unscathed, came to translate. "He says the man with one heart fights like he has two," the warrior said. "He says the life debt is paid." Vulcan looked at the chaos, the bodies littering the yard in front of the quiet cabin. "A great evil has been cleansed from our people tonight. The heart of the mountain will sleep in peace." He then looked toward his daughter, Sautayo, who was now standing beside Elias. The look that passed between the chief and his daughter was complex, a mixture of anger, pride, and fierce, unbreakable love. He had used her, risked her life, but he had done it to save them all. The next morning the Cheyenne departed, taking their prisoners and their dead with them. Vulcan himself led a small party to the secret mine. Using powder stolen from Silas's camp, they collapsed the entrance, bearing the cursed gold forever. Their future would not be bought with rifles, but earned with wisdom. The ranch was quiet again, but it was a different silence. The bullet holes in the walls and the dark stains in the dirt were a testament to the fact that the world had come crashing in, and Elias had not broken. He had found something in the violence he had never expected to find again, a reason to live. Saltayo stayed behind to help him put his home back together. For a few days they worked side by side, speaking little, but sharing an understanding that ran deeper than words. There was a connection between them, a spark of something that could, in another life, have become a fire. But they both knew it wasn't to be. Her path was with her people, helping them heal. His was here, on this patch of land that now held more than just ghosts. On the day she was to leave, she found him by the cottonwood tree, standing before Martha's grave. "She was very beautiful," Saudio said softly, looking at the crude stone marker. "She was," Elias said, his voice thick. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, faded photograph of Martha. He had carried it with him for 5 years, a sacred relic. He held it out to Sautayo. "Keep this," he said, "so you remember what a heart that is loyal looks like." She took it, her fingers brushing his. It was not an act of forgetting Martha, but of sharing her, of letting her memory be a bridge, not a wall. Sautayo looked at him, her eyes shining. "And you," she said, "remember what it is to have a heart that beats." She mounted her horse and rode away, not looking back. Elias watched her go, a strange mix of sorrow and peace settling over him. He walked back to his cabin. The door was open. The morning light was pouring in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. For the first time in 5 years, it didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a home. He sat on his porch, a cup of coffee in his hand, and watched the sun climb into the vast Wyoming sky. He wasn't waiting for the end anymore. He was watching the beginning. The man with one heart, who asked for nothing but to be left alone, ended up saving a nation and finding a piece of his own soul in the process. It just goes to show you that sometimes the greatest battles are fought in the quietest places. If you believe that even a broken heart can learn to beat again, do me a favor and smash that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments below, what would you have done if you were Elias? Would you have turned away, or would you have answered the call? Thanks for listening.